Nguyen Thi Han polishes the glass case every morning before the museum opens. She has done this for 11 years. The object inside weighs almost nothing. A rusted cylinder, faded red and white, the Schlitz logo barely legible through corrosion and age. Visitors walk past it constantly on their way to the larger exhibits. Most assume it's debris. Litter from the American presence maybe, preserved as some kind of political statement. It is not litter. The placard underneath, printed in Vietnamese and English, identifies it as an improvised anti-personnel mine recovered from Quang Nam province. The date given is March 1967. 3 Marines from 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines died when someone's boot caught a tripwire connected to this thing, or rather, to what this thing used to be. The can itself survived because it was the outer casing. The C4 packed inside it did not survive. The ball bearings pressed into the explosive charge didn't either, and Lance Corporal David Reeves, 20 years old, from Dayton, Ohio, least of all. The other 2 names on the placard are Vietnamese transliterations of American names, and the spelling doesn't quite match any casualty records from that week. Sources conflict on the exact date by 2 days. What isn't in dispute is the engineering. Someone, probably a local guerrilla, possibly trained at a regional seminar on improvised ordnance, took an American beer can discarded by American troops, filled it with American C4 explosive, likely captured or bought on the black market, added steel ball bearings probably manufactured in China, and wired it to a pressure-release trigger built from a clothespin and 2 strips of metal. Total material cost in 1967, functionally zero. Every component was either scavenged, captured, or made from household items. A retired Marine sergeant named Paul Decker, who served in Quang Nam that same year, later described the feeling of patrolling through villages where the trash from your own base could kill you. He put it simply, the worst part wasn't the enemy you couldn't see, it was knowing your own garbage was the weapon. The beer can in its glass case is the physical residue of a problem the United States military spent years trying to solve and never fully did. Between 1965 and 1973, booby traps and mines accounted for somewhere between 11 and 17% of all American combat deaths in Vietnam, depending on which study you trust and how broadly you define the category. In certain provinces during certain years, the percentage climbed far higher. The 3rd Marine Division reported periods where mines and booby traps caused more casualties than all other enemy weapons combined. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army didn't invent the booby trap, but they refined it into something closer to a strategic weapon system than anyone had managed before, or arguably since. The Central Highlands smelled like rot. Not the rot of death specifically, though that was present often enough, but the wet organic decay of a jungle floor where nothing ever fully dried out. Vegetation fell, decomposed halfway, then got buried under new growth before the process finished. The air at ground level in triple canopy jungle carried a thickness you could almost chew, humid, fungal, heavy with the sweetness of things breaking down. 19-year-old infantrymen from places like Nebraska and Connecticut had never breathed anything like it. Several veterans described the smell as the first thing they remembered decades later, before the sounds, before the fear. The terrain made the booby trap possible. Not just possible, inevitable. Vietnam's geography funneled American patrols into predictable corridors with an efficiency no human planner could have matched. In the highlands, triple canopy jungle meant visibility dropped to 15 or 20 feet in good conditions. Undergrowth grew so dense that cutting a new path with machetes advanced a platoon maybe 400 meters per hour. Nobody did that if a trail existed, and trails always existed. The paddies were worse in a different way. Rice paddies meant open ground bordered by dikes, raised earthen walls roughly a foot high, sometimes 2. Walking across an open paddy made you a target for sniper fire, so you walked the dikes. Everyone walked the dikes. The Viet Cong knew you walked the dikes. A declassified Marine Corps study from 1969 broke down the terrain problem with unusual bluntness. In most operational areas, American units had between 2 and 4 viable movement routes for any given patrol. The enemy needed to prepare only those routes. Fewer paths meant higher probability that any single trap would find a boot. You might think experienced units would vary their routes, push through the difficult terrain to stay unpredictable. Some did. The cost was exhaustion, slower movement, reduced patrol coverage, and higher rates of heat casualties. A company commander in the 25th Infantry Division estimated his unit's effective patrol range dropped by 60% when they avoided established trails. So you had a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. Move predictably and risk the trap, or move unpredictably and accomplish almost nothing. The red laterite soil common in much of South Vietnam added another layer to the problem. When dry, laterite packed hard enough to hide a pressure plate with minimal disturbance. When wet, and it was wet for roughly half the year during monsoon seasons, the mud swallowed everything. A buried device left no visible trace after a single rainfall. Mine detectors, the standard ANPES 11, struggled with laterite because the soil's high iron content produced constant false readings. Sweep teams in some areas reported hitting false positives every few feet, which meant either stopping constantly or learning to ignore the detector. Both options ended badly. The trails themselves became psychological terrain as much as physical. A point man, the soldier walking first in a patrol column, had an average effective duty span of about 1 month before the stress became unsustainable. Multiple infantry unit reports across different divisions and years put it at roughly the same number. 1 month of walking first, staring at the ground, knowing that the dirt under your next step might be the last thing you ever failed to notice. The jungle didn't plant the traps, but it held them perfectly and hid them completely, and it delivered American soldiers to them along paths that might as well have been painted with arrows. Captain Robert Wall typed his report with 2 fingers on a Remington portable in a plywood office outside Saigon. The date was August 1962. He had spent 4 months embedded with an ARVN Ranger Battalion in the Mekong Delta, and in that time he had watched booby traps account for more friendly casualties than ambushes, mortar attacks, sniper fire, and direct engagements put together. His report ran 14 pages. The language was specific. Triggering mechanisms, placement patterns, the relationship between local infrastructure and trap density. He included hand-drawn diagrams of 7 distinct device types he had personally examined or recovered. He recommended that all incoming advisory personnel receive dedicated countermine training before deployment, and that MACV establish a centralized reporting system to track trap types by province and frequency. The report went to the Military Assistance Advisory Group's operations section. Nobody responded. Wall's after-action document sat in a filing system that, according to a later internal review, contained over 2,000 advisory reports from that year alone. The review, conducted in 1966, noted that fewer than 30% had received any formal acknowledgement. Wall wasn't alone. Major Kenneth Grubb, an engineer officer advising South Vietnamese forces in Quang Ngai province, submitted similar findings in early 1963. Grubb went further. He argued that the booby trap wasn't a nuisance weapon but a deliberate tactical system designed to slow movement, erode morale, channel American-advised units into predictable defensive postures, and strip initiative from patrol leaders at the squad level. The word he used was architecture. The Viet Cong were building an architecture of denial across the countryside, and conventional counterinsurgency doctrine had no answer for it. Grubb's assessment was, by any reasonable standard, exactly correct. MACV's planning staff at the time was focused on building the South Vietnamese military into a conventional fighting force capable of holding territory through firepower and mobility. Booby traps didn't fit that framework. They were a problem for the field, not for strategy. You might think this was simple negligence, but the institutional logic made a kind of sense if you squinted hard enough. In 1962 and 63, American combat troops weren't yet deployed in large numbers. The advisory mission's priority was building ARVN capacity for set-piece engagements. A 14-page report about tripwires and buried shells competed for attention against questions about artillery training, officer development, air support coordination, and logistics infrastructure. The small war underneath the big war didn't register. By 1965, when the Marines landed at Da Nang and the Army's ground commitment began in earnest, Wall and Grubb's warnings were 3 years old and buried under thousands of pages of paperwork that nobody was going back to read. A former Viet Cong sapper who defected in 1968 described his training as learning to think like water, find the path of least resistance, then make that path lethal. His instructors, he said, never used the word weapon. They called their devices lessons. The curriculum was extensive. At the lowest level sat the Punji stake, sharpened bamboo, sometimes smeared with human feces or the residue of decaying animal matter to promote infection, planted in concealed pits along trails and at likely rest stops. A Punji pit might be 18 inches deep or 4 feet deep depending on the intended effect. Shallow pits maimed feet. Deep pits broke legs. The bamboo itself cost nothing. A single guerrilla could prepare a dozen pits in one night using tools no more sophisticated than a machete and a digging stick. You might think the Punji stake was primitive to the point of irrelevance against a modern military. The casualty statistics complicate that assumption. Through 1965 and 66, Punji stakes accounted for roughly 2% of all American casualties requiring medical evacuation in certain tactical zones. 2% doesn't sound like much until you multiply it across hundreds of thousands of patrols. The infections alone kept men out of action for weeks. Above the Punji stake in complexity came the grenade trap. The most common variant used an M26 fragmentation grenade, American-manufactured, usually captured or purchased with the pin pulled and the spoon held in place by a tin can or a section of bamboo tube. A tripwire attached to the grenade body. When the wire pulled the grenade free of its container, the spoon released and the fuse gave you between 4 and 5 seconds. In dense vegetation, 4 seconds was not enough time to do anything useful. The Viet Cong also manufactured their own grenades from cast-off materials. Condensed milk cans filled with explosive and scrap metal appeared so frequently that American EOD teams developed a shorthand for them. The construction was crude, but irregular shrapnel travels unpredictably through soft tissue in ways that uniform steel fragments do not. The fragmentation pattern made them more dangerous than they looked. Then came the pressure-detonated mine, ranging from a single mortar round buried nose-up in a trail to elaborate daisy chain configurations where one triggering device set off 2, 4, sometimes 6 charges simultaneously along a stretch of path. A daisy chain could destroy an entire squad in a single activation. The wiring was basic det cord connecting multiple charges to a single initiator. The placement required patience, local knowledge, and an understanding of how American units spaced themselves on patrol. Standard infantry doctrine called for 5-meter intervals between soldiers. The Viet Cong knew this. They spaced their charges accordingly. The most psychologically effective devices were the ones designed to wound rather than kill. A dead soldier required no further resources from the American military. A wounded soldier required a medevac helicopter, a medical team, weeks or months of hospital care, and whatever his squadmates carried with them afterward, the sound, the image, the knowledge that the trail ahead held more of the same. None of this was incidental. Wounding was more expensive than killing. Sergeant First Class Danny Rowe pulled a dud 105mm howitzer round out of the mud near Cu Chi in March 1967. Stenciled on the casing in white block letters was the lot number of an ammunition plant in Joliet, Illinois. Rowe had trained at that plant before deploying. He recognized the batch code. The round had been fired by American artillery, failed to detonate, and been recovered by Viet Cong sappers who packed it with additional explosive and buried it in a trail where it blew the legs off a specialist from 2nd Battalion the following week. The dud rate for American artillery in Vietnam hovered around 5% depending on the ammunition type and age of the shells. 5% sounds acceptable until you look at the volume of fire. American forces expended roughly 10 million artillery rounds per year at peak operational tempo. 5% of 10 million is 500,000 unexploded shells scattered across the Vietnamese countryside annually. Each one a gift. The Viet Cong didn't need supply lines for explosives. They needed shovels. Captured American ordnance made up an estimated 78% of the explosive material used in Viet Cong booby traps, according to a McAfee technical intelligence assessment from 1969. The figure is staggering enough that it bears repeating. Nearly 4 out of every 5 devices that killed or maimed American soldiers contained American-manufactured explosives. M26 grenades, claymore mines with their wiring reversed, mortar rounds of every caliber, blocks of C4 plastic explosive taken from engineering supply caches. The Viet Cong operated what amounted to a recycling program for American firepower. The claymore situations was particularly maddening. The M18A1 Claymore was a directional anti-personnel mine containing 700 steel ball bearings behind a curved layer of C4. It was designed to be command detonated by American troops. You aimed the face reading front toward enemy at your kill zone, ran wire back to your position, and triggered it electrically. Elegant in concept. The problem was that claymores went missing constantly. They were cached at fire bases, carried on patrol, left behind during hasty withdrawals, abandoned at overrun positions. Captured claymores showed up rigged as booby traps with tripwire initiators. The front toward enemy label now pointed at whatever American patrol came down the path next. The M79 grenade launcher round became another favorite. Unfired rounds taken from casualties or abandoned positions could be rigged as pressure devices with minimal modification. A bamboo housing, a nail as a firing pin, the weight of a boot, and nothing else that completed the circuit. Geographically, the irony ran even deeper. American bombing along the Ho Chi Minh Trail and across the DMZ deposited thousands of tons of unexploded ordnance in precisely the areas where the North Vietnamese army moved supplies southward. Bomb disposal wasn't a priority for forces under constant air attack. They simply marked the duds and came back later to harvest them. The common garden spider in Vietnam, Argiope mangal, builds its web with a distinctive zigzag pattern called a stabilimentum. Arachnologists still argue about its purpose. One camp says it attracts prey, while another insists it warns birds away from the web so they don't destroy it. The debate has lasted decades. This connects to nothing about ordnance recovery. Back to the explosives. The engineering problem for MaxEV was circular and essentially unsolvable within existing doctrine. More firepower meant more duds. More duds meant more material for the enemy. Reducing firepower to limit dud availability was never seriously considered. The suggestion appears nowhere in planning documents from any level of command. Artillery support was doctrinal bedrock. You didn't question it. So the cycle continued, and American shells kept finding American soldiers, just later than intended. The medevac request form was 6 inches by 4 inches. Carbon paper between 3 copies, date, grid coordinates, number of casualties, type of injury, priority level, unit designation. A clerk at the 93rd Evacuation Hospital in Long Bin estimated he processed 40 of these forms on a quiet day. On a bad day, he stopped counting. Each form represented a calculation the Viet Cong had already completed. One American wounded by a booby trap removed an average of 6.5 soldiers from offensive operations. The wounded man himself, 2 to 4 soldiers providing immediate security around the casualty site. A medic, the radio operator calling in the helicopter. Everyone stopped. Everyone waited. The patrol was over. A declassified study from the Army concept team in Vietnam, dated November 1967, attempted to quantify the operational costs. A single booby trap casualty consumed an average of 2.4 hours of helicopter time, including transit, hover, extraction, and return to base. Multiply that across the roughly 7,500 booby trap casualties recorded in 1967 alone. The math produces 18,000 helicopter hours, dedicated exclusively to recovering men hurt by devices that cost almost nothing to build. The helicopter time looks like the real expense. It wasn't. What accumulated was harder to measure and harder to fix. Staff Sergeant Michael Pelkey, 25th Infantry Division, Tay Ninh Province. His squad hit a daisy chain on the morning of February 9, 1968, 3 days before the second wave of Tet. 2 men wounded, neither fatally. Pelkey's after-action report noted that his squad refused to advance beyond the blast site for 47 minutes, despite receiving no further contact. He wrote that the men were physically capable of continuing but functionally unable to move forward. The phrase he used was rooted down, rooted down. Pelkey's 2 wounded soldiers went to the 12th Evacuation Hospital at Tzu Chi. One returned to duty in 9 days. The other lost his right foot below the ankle at 7:22 that evening, 19 years old, from a town in central Ohio with a population of about 800. The squad Pelkey led on its next patrol walked at half the speed of its previous average. Nobody ordered them to slow down. The Viet Cong didn't need to plant another device on that stretch of trail. The first one was still working. The men who broke the cycle were the ones nobody wanted to be. Tunnel rats volunteered. That fact alone set them apart from virtually every other hazardous assignment in Vietnam, where the verb volunteered usually meant someone higher up the chain had done the volunteering for you. But crawling into a Viet Cong tunnel complex with a flashlight and a .45 caliber pistol was considered so far beyond reasonable expectation that commanders couldn't order it in good conscience. The men who went down were self-selected, undersized usually because the tunnels averaged 2 feet by 2.5 feet in cross-section. Claustrophobic men didn't last. Nobody lasted long. Specialist 4th Class Robert Baird, 1st Infantry Division, weighed 132 pounds and stood 5 feet 4 inches tall. He cleared tunnels in the Iron Triangle through the first half of 1967. Baird described the smell inside as something between wet clay and copper, the copper being old blood soaked into laterite soil that never fully dried. He could taste it on his tongue for hours afterward. What Baird and men like him brought back up from those tunnels changed how the Army understood the booby trap problem. They found workshops, not crude holes with a few tools scattered around, but organized production facilities with assembly stations, quality testing areas, component storage sorted by type, and finished inventory ready for distribution. The Viet Cong were manufacturing devices on something approaching an industrial basis, underground, invisible to aerial reconnaissance and artillery both. Baird reported one chamber near Ben Suk that contained over 200 completed pressure-detonated mines stacked on wooden shelving. The craftsmanship, he said, was better than what he'd seen in stateside training aids. You might think this intelligence would have accelerated the institutional response. The 25th Infantry Division's combat engineers had been arguing since mid-1966 that booby trap countermeasures needed dedicated training time and specialized detection equipment, plus unit-level expertise rather than division-level attachments that showed up after someone was already hurt. Their proposals sat in administrative channels for months. The engineers kept submitting them. The proposals kept sitting. What finally moved the bureaucracy was arithmetic, the same mathematics from those medevac forms and helicopter hours. When the cumulative cost became impossible to file away, MakeCV authorized the creation of specialized countermine teams and approved a training curriculum built almost entirely from field-generated knowledge, not from doctrine manuals written in the States, but from men like Baird who had crawled through the production facilities and combat engineers who had disassembled hundreds of devices and cataloged their triggering mechanisms. The curriculum that emerged in late 1967 and early 1968 bore an uncomfortable resemblance to what Captain Robert Wall had recommended in his 1962 report. Dedicated countermine personnel, integration of local intelligence about device placement patterns, systematic reporting of device types by grid square to build predictive maps, along with standardized procedures for evidence recovery after each incident. Wall had seen the problem 6 years before the institution caught up, and the engineers who kept resubmitting their proposals had seen it 2 years before. The tunnel rats finally confirmed it with physical evidence pulled from underground. The smell of burning diesel and human waste hung over Forward Operating Base Loyalty in eastern Baghdad on the morning of April 14, 2004. Specialist Kevin Durding, 21st Engineer Battalion, was 23 years old and had been in country for 6 weeks. He was examining a section of Route Irish, the airport road, the most bombed stretch of pavement on Earth at that point in the war, looking for disturbed soil, unusual debris, anything that broke the visual pattern of the roadside. He had received 4 hours of counter-ID instruction at Fort Leonard Wood before deploying. 4 hours to learn what the Army had spent 6 years learning in Vietnam and then filed away. Durding found the device, a 155mm artillery shell wired to a modified garage door opener, buried under a dead dog on the median. He spotted the antenna wire protruding from the carcass. His training, such as it was, told him to mark the location and pull back. He did. The explosive ordnance disposal team neutralized it 40 minutes later. Durding went back out the next morning and did it again. The doctrine that could have prepared Durding and thousands like him already existed. It had been written in 1968, revised in 1969, tested across 4 core tactical zones in Vietnam, and then effectively abandoned after the withdrawal. The Army's countermine curriculum, the one built from tunnel rat intelligence and combat engineer field reports, and 6 years of accumulated casualties, was not classified. No one destroyed it. The Cold War Army that rebuilt itself after Vietnam simply let it become irrelevant, orienting towards Soviet armored formations on the plains of Central Europe. Mines in that context meant large anti-tank devices laid in geometric patterns across known avenues of approach. Detectable, predictable, nothing like a beer can full of explosive buried where a soldier would step. The institutional forgetting was thorough. By 2003, the Army's mine warfare doctrine referenced improvised devices in a single paragraph. One paragraph for the weapon category that had produced the most casualties in its last major ground war. A Rand Corporation study published in 2006 called The Knowledge Gap a doctrinal failure of the First Order, their phrase pulled directly from the executive summary. The study traced the lineage of IED tactics in Iraq back through the Lebanese Civil War, the Soviet-Afghan conflict, and ultimately to the Viet Cong techniques documented in those MaxCV intelligence assessments that had gathered dust for 3 decades. The Vietnamese bamboo housing with a nail firing pin had become a PVC pipe with a wooden dowel. Daisy-chained artillery rounds along a jungle trail were now daisy-chained artillery rounds along a highway median. Where a man hiding in a spider hole once triggered a command-detonated mine, a man with a cell phone now did the same thing from a rooftop a kilometer away. The engineering principles were identical. The materials had barely changed. You might think that Vietnam veterans within the senior ranks would have recognized the pattern immediately. Some did. Retired Colonel James Burton, who had served with the 9th Infantry Division in the Mekong Delta, wrote a letter to the Army Chief of Staff in May 2004 explicitly comparing the IED campaign in Iraq to the booby trap campaign in Vietnam. He listed 7 tactical parallels and recommended the immediate revival of the countermine training curriculum from 1968 as a foundation for counter-ID doctrine. The letter was acknowledged with a form response. The Vietnamese pot-bellied pig has the shortest gestation period of any domestic pig breed. 114 days on average. Breeders in the Mekong Delta region have maintained the line for over 1,000 years. This connects to nothing about institutional memory. By the time the Joint IED Defeat Organization stood up in 2006 with a budget that eventually exceeded $4 billion per year, the United States had already lost over 1,000 service members to improvised explosive devices in Iraq alone. The counter-IED technologies that emerged, electronic jammers, mine-resistant vehicles, ground-penetrating radar, were engineering solutions to a problem that had been fundamentally human in Vietnam and remained fundamentally human in Iraq. The devices worked because they exploited patterns. Patrol routes repeated, vehicles channeled into predictable lanes, and soldiers walked where the ground looked safe. Specialist Durding survived his deployment. He came home to Missouri in January 2005. The dead dog on Route Irish stayed with him, not the device inside it, but the moment before he identified what he was looking at, when it was just a dead animal on a road full of dead animals, and his 4 hours of training had to compete against everything his eyes were telling him was ordinary. The war is still killing people in Vietnam. That statement is not metaphorical. Quang Tri Province, the northernmost territory of the old South Vietnam, remains the most contaminated piece of ground on Earth. 83.8% of its land area contains unexploded ordnance, American bombs, American artillery shells, American cluster munitions, and Vietnamese mines and booby traps that have sat in laterite soil for over 50 years with their firing mechanisms intact. Between 1975 and 2022, unexploded devices killed over 40,000 Vietnamese civilians and wounded more than 60,000 others. The killing never stopped. The war just lost its audience. The beer can in the Ho Chi Minh City War Remnants Museum, the one Nguyen Thi Han polishes every mornings, sits behind glass on a wooden pedestal, Schlitz brand. The label has faded to a pale brown. Inside the can, visible through a cutaway section, a detonator housing made from whittled bamboo still holds a rusted nail that once served as a firing pin. The placard identifies it as a representative example of a Viet Cong anti-personnel device, circa 1966. Nowhere does it mention that the design concept originated in Chinese resistance manuals from the 1940s, or that Captain Robert Wald documented the pattern in his 1962 report. The 25th Infantry Division engineers, whose proposals sat in administrative limbo while the casualty numbers climbed, go unmentioned entirely. The can weighs almost nothing. Vietnamese demining teams from Project Renew work the soil in Quang Tri 6 days a week, 50 weeks a year. They use metal detectors that cost about $4,000 apiece, descendants, in engineering terms, of the same detection equipment the Army's countermine teams carried in 1968. A trained technician clears an average of 20 square meters per day. At that rate, with current funding, Quang Tri province alone will take over a century to fully clear. The technicians are mostly young Vietnamese men and women born decades after the last American helicopter lifted off the embassy roof. They dig carefully. The soil gives up its objects one at a time. 11,835 American soldiers wounded or killed by mines and booby traps in Vietnam between 1965 and 1970. 60,000 more Vietnamese civilians wounded by what the ground held after everyone else went home. 40,000 Vietnamese civilians killed by it. One beer can behind glass.